Welcome to Big Blend Radio with your hosts, Lisa and Nancy, editors of BigBlendMagazine.com.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio with Nancy and Lisa. Every first Monday, we get to chat with Mike Guardia. He is an award-winning author, a military historian, and a historian of, and I don't care what you ask him, he knows everything. He really does when it comes to history. He's also a U.S. Army veteran, and I believe he's up to 21 books. Many people know him from the acclaimed biography, Hal Moore, A Soldier Once and Always, that chronicles the life of Lieutenant Harold G. Moore, and it was also featured in the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson. His latest book, Mike Guardia again, is Danger Forward, The Forgotten Wars of General Paul F. Gorman. And we're excited because we know March there'll be a new book, Combat Diaries, coming out. So you can keep up with Mike at MikeGuardia.com and, of course, BigBlendRadio.com for our every first Monday with Mike talking about military history. So welcome back, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Lisa, I'm doing great. It's great to be on the show as always.
Hey, we're excited today. You know, There's one thing on our Love Your Parkster as we travel across the country. We document parks and public lands, and you're like, well, you got to do generals and military history, you know, which honestly, when I started going back through some of our files, I'm like, oh, we could write a book for some of the places we've been, right? Because military history is so big. But we were going to talk because February is President's Day weekend comes up. And Nancy has this thing about thinking that presidents should serve in the military in some capacity or do some kind of community service to understand warfare and just to have that general understanding. Oh, I used the general word again. Anyway, so we were talking about going back and forth about what presidents, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, we were on Eisenhower's farm outside Gettysburg, President Eisenhower's farm. And then, oh, let's talk about the interstate system. And then I realized, oh, we also had Little Rock High School, which is the only high school that's a national park unit. It's a national monument because of the Little Rock Nine, the 9 Black kids that went to school. That was after Brown versus Board or Board versus Brown, I'll get it straight. But at that point, segregation was supposed to go away in schools. And apparently Eisenhower said, let them in, and sent the National Guard when the governor of Arkansas tried to stop what was supposed to rightfully happen. So we've been to a few, and I know there's more, especially the interstate system, which we know very well. So welcome back to talk about Ike, great Ike. So he's amazing, isn't he? Like really his history, I had no idea how distinguished
he did a lot.
He was, you know, and is in our history.
He sure is.
Yeah.
Not only a great leader, but also a great president. You know, here was a guy from the American heartland, and rose to do great things and left a very long-lasting legacy behind.
It seems that he also was able to work between both major parties. I know he's Republican, but he was like moderate conservative, right? But seemed to balance both sides. And when I was looking at his election records, it looks like when he got elected, it was like
the landslide.
Majority of it was a landslide. One of those, like the country said, heck yeah, which was pretty, we don't have that anymore. We don't. But
because I think he was so well known for what he did through his military career. People knew who he was.
Right.
I just remember my grandmother, I used to think, she had a crush on him, but she just said, we would not be free today if it wasn't for him. And she really felt like, it's almost like he single-handedly won World War II, you know. She's like, if it wasn't for his direction and his ability to make changes, no matter how drastic they were, at home and overseas, that we really wouldn't be free today. She used to drill that in my head. So when I see Eisenhower, I'd like bow down.
Tell us a little bit about his history, because I was reading that he actually really wanted to serve even in World War I, right?
Right. Yeah, so Ike was a graduate of West Point. He was a member of the class of 1915, and that particular West Point class has a pretty unique place in history because it's known colloquially as the class that the stars fell on. And they hold that distinction because of all of the graduates of 1915, an overwhelming majority of them went on to achieve flag rank. And
Wow.
his class included the likes of Omar Bradley and James Van Fleet and several others who would become big names, not only in World War I, but also World War II, and would play a very critical role in the early years of the Cold War.
Wow.
And Eisenhower, when after he graduated from West Point, he was one of many of his classmates who really wanted to go overseas and fight in World War I. This was the first. This was really the first global conflict that class was exposed to. But for one reason or another, the cards fell as they were, and he was relegated to stateside posts. But even those stateside assignments that he had during the war helped plant the seeds for a lot of the great legacy programs that he would do later. As a matter of fact, it was his stateside duty overseeing military convoys in California that really gave him the idea for expanding the nation's highway system.
That was interesting about the highway system, because I first heard about that when we started covering Route 66 in Arizona, because pretty much this was one of the most traveled routes way back in the day. When you think about the Great American Road Trip, this was the mother road. And of course, there's some other highways as well. We're about to do Jefferson Highway from Winnipeg to New Orleans. That's going to be something coming up. Maybe we'll detour and see you, right? So we'll be up there somewhere, but we're not seeing you in winter. Sorry. We'll still come see you in Minnesota, and winter's not happening for us. Sorry, it just isn't.
I don't, because I'm looking at the thermometer right now, and it says that the ambient temperature outside is 2 below zero.
We're not coming to see you in winter, but we'll see you in spring or summer, most likely summer. But you think about this, the American road trip, people also had this feeling of being able to explore and enjoy their country. It's a very interesting time frame of what happened with Route 66. And because of the interstate system, Route 66 kind of fell away from the American road trip and became convenience. And if you go down like 40, which is, if you loosely follow Interstate 40, you'll hit Route 66 on and off. But business did actually crumble for a lot of areas. And now it's becoming part of the National Historic trails that we have, a National Historic road and route. And like Arizona, I think, was one of the first states to really stand up and say, hey, we need to stand up for Route 66, get people to come off the interstate. But this is the American culture of where we are. If there's a Big Mac, or are we going to go to the little store, the mom and pop store? So that's where I first learned about Eisenhower. And I have to say, going through the revolution of Route 66 becoming popular again, which it is, I didn't really like what he did. But then I had to realize, Nancy's like, no, he needed the route. Wasn't it for tanks to be able to maneuver across the country?
Right, and it was also designed to be was also designed to be an evacuation thoroughfare, so that in the event that there was a nuclear war or any type of conflict that came to the shores of the United States, then people would have an easy means of egress, from wherever they were in the U.S. and they could very quickly escape from one area to another.
Oh, wow. I did not know that part of it. So, because I thought it was about tanks, and we're used to seeing tanks, like, I don't know if they're tanks now, that they're big with the big wheelie things. This sounds terrible, but you know what I mean? When we lived out in 29 Palms, we had all the big interstates, and you'd see them go, and it's like, talk about a convoy. And it's like, dude, I'm scared. I'm not going to go follow too closely. You never know what could happen. But to me, that's amazing, the evacuation routes. And you've got to think, because he really was instrumental in wanting to kick North Korea's butt at one point in regards to nuclear war. And even, if he was alive today, right now, I wonder where he would, what he would think about what to do in regards to Russia and North Korea, and even China, right? He was involved with that too.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I can say about Ike is that he was a hawk when it came to national defense, and he and MacArthur, I think, had a very similar mindset to say that, you know, if we are going to engage in armed conflict, then the only acceptable outcome is going to be either A, the total annihilation of the enemy, or we are going to make them feel defeated to a point where they will accept any terms of an unconditional surrender.
Yeah. So he was really one of those, like, if you're going to do it, do it.
Right.
Well, yeah, because you can't do it halfway, because then you just have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And eventually you lose.
Mhm.
If you do it halfway, I think you would probably lose eventually. So I get his mindset. It was drilled into me by my grandmother that, you know, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't, we wouldn't be free if it wasn't for Eisenhower. She never mentioned any other person in the military.
But that was because, isn't it also true about him really being instrumental in the invasion of Normandy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, pretty much from the get-go, that was his baby. You know, he said that. You know, he said that, okay, if we're going to invade the European mainland, here's what we have to do first. First, we have to establish a base of operations in North Africa. We have to establish something that's close to the European mainland, to the soft underbelly of Europe as a staging area. And how we have to attack it first is we have to get a foothold on Italy. And then what we have to do is, if we know that all of the highest concentration of German forces is within occupied France proper, then we need to do a pincer movement. We need to invade from the north along the beaches of Normandy. And we also have to have a southern invasion of France, which would eventually become Operation Dragoon. And he said, okay, well, we can do this at the same time. We can do this at the same time if we can land troops in Normandy first, and at the same time also land them on the beaches of southern France by the Riviera. We'll envelop the Nazi forces there and be able to push all the way into the borders of the fatherland. Now, that was the plan, but unfortunately, they didn't have enough warships available to facilitate two simultaneous invasions. So what they ended up doing is they said is Ike took a step back and said, okay, well, if I had to choose which one I'm going to invade first, do I want to invade northern France first, or do I want to invade the south? I think I would be better served if I invaded the north first, because that's where I know all the heaviest defenses are. And if I can pacify all of those defenses first, and if I can divert enough of the Wehrmacht's attention to fighting our occupation force in the north, it's going to make it that much easier to invade in the south. And when we invade in the south, we can hook up with the Free French forces. We can hook up with the French partisans, and really facilitate the enemy's destruction in central France. And then that'll make it that much easier to push into the borders of Germany itself.
Wow. So this is, I mean, could you imagine being him in looking at that kind of invasion and
the
knowing
strategy.
that, I mean,
I bet he was
you
a
have
really,
cojones to do that.
No,
I mean,
I
you had
bet-
to have some confidence in what
I bet he
you're
was a really
doing,
good
you know?
chess player. I bet
Oh,
he
yeah.
played chess, because, you know, he really thought it all the way from beginning to end, exactly from all angles. I don't know how much intelligence he had, you know, from other people telling him, well, the train's like this, and there's these forces here, how much intelligence he was able to gather before making these plans. But he seemed to really know what was happening on the ground.
It did, and it required a lot of diplomacy on his part too, because when he assumed command of Allied forces in Europe, he was actually starting behind the eight ball, because here was a two-star general, and he was a two-star general who had never been in a war before. And he's assuming command of a lot of his subordinate commanders. He's going in and he's talking to all of these British generals and field marshals who not only have experience in World War I, but they also have recent experience fighting the Germans in World War II. And, you know, here he comes, this completely inexperienced general, and has convinced them that, you know, hey, the plan that I'm presenting to you distinguished combat veterans now, which is being implemented by all of these, you know, farm boys from Kansas and
Wow.
all of these street kids from LA, this is going to be what saves you, and this is what's going to be this is essentially what's going to be the savior of Europe. So, you know, to market it to that distinguished body of military leaders in Europe, I mean, if that is not leadership, and if that is not diplomacy, then I have no idea what is.
That's amazing, because
yeah.
it kind of goes with Hal Moore, you know, when you
Mhm.
talk about how he had to have that connectivity and being
Right.
on the farm. Again, it's outside Gettysburg, right? And so like we've said before, going to Gettysburg is, and there's a cemetery there for World War II veterans in Gettysburg as well. So there is that connection. And I think that's partly why he bought land there, and had that farm. And his wife was adamant about him going to the farm. She said there's a sign, when I was reading through things, that the farm saved Ike's life twice. And that's, you know, because the sun porch and taking a walk, he has a United States flag, and they would walk to the pond every time he was getting uptight or having his plan things. She'd make him go for a walk to the flag, so they would go to the pond and reflect and calm down. But what he did, and we weren't able to go inside, you can take virtual tours, everyone, if you go to nps.gov and just look up the Eisenhower National Historic Site in Pennsylvania. I was going to say Maryland, because we were staying in Maryland at the time, in Tawnytown. You can go on there and see the 3Ds of inside. We could see some of the machinery for the farm. They even have a gas station, their own Chevron gas pumps there on the farm. But well, because he had a helicopter pad, because they had to bring him in. But his diplomacy was, when he was working with leaders that came over to the country, to the US, he brought them out to the farm, and they even have their own cottage out there. You can see it's it's modest. You know, the farm looks grand, and the greenery behind us, that's actually like a miniature golf course at the by the barn. But he said that he brought people there because he felt like everyone could just kind of, this isn't his words, but get over themselves or whatever. It's more of a relaxed atmosphere where people could just be real and get past the White House kind of Pentagon zone of how things are, and just be people and truly reconnect. And that's how he looked at, he made real relationships, and he was able to help in negotiations by taking people to the farm. That's just part of that, you know, that diplomacy with taking people out and just, let's just reconnect as human beings in a beautiful, beautiful area, you know. It's pretty amazing. But he was also involved with the Bay of Pigs. Tell us about this, because that didn't go too well either, right? And I think he had to hand it over to Kennedy. So refresh us all about the Bay of Pigs, because that was a
mess.
Cuban Missile Crisis. Here we go.
All right, so let's go ahead and wind the clocks back to 1961. It was actually a little bit of a carryover from the Eisenhower administration, headlong into the Kennedy years. And, you know, for most of Ike's presidency, he enjoyed some pretty stable relations with Cuba. You know, I mean, throughout the 1950s, you really had Cuba as America's primary playground. And, you know, here you had this tropical paradise that was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And, you know, you had a lot of two-way traffic there. You had a lot of Americans who had, you know, homes and beach houses and timeshares. And it was a place where any American could go to unwind and relax. And at the time, it was the bastion of a dictator named Batista. Well, you know, for lack of a better term, Batista was a pretty repressive dictator. And, you know, in the tragic irony that tends to befall a lot of the popular revolutions that happened down in Latin America, you had people trading one brutal dictator for another, and that was the rise of our friend Fidel Castro. And in 1959, that's when the Cuban Revolution really starts to hit critical mass, and you have the Batista government being ousted, and then you have a communist dictatorship established under the auspices of Mr. Fidel Castro. Well, he very quickly establishes a close relationship with the Soviet Union, and this is happening right as the Eisenhower presidency is coming to an end. So Ike and his vice president at the time, Nixon, start to sit down and think, okay, well, we have a communist enclave that is less than 100 miles off the coast of Miami. Now, all of a sudden, communism isn't something that's confined to Western Europe. It's not something that's confined to the far confines of East Asia. Now it's something that's right in our backyard. And if Cuba fell that quickly, given everything we know about the stability of Latin America as a whole, how long is it going to be before other Latin American countries start to tip in the direction of communist Cuba? So, being that we don't like him, being that it's pretty fair that the fair assessment that he doesn't like us, and that his best friend is our public enemy number one, how do we get rid of this guy? And plans were being drawn up to either assassinate Castro by some passive means. There was even an idea that was floated around of planting an explosive cigar in one of his palaces. They were
cool.
very creative in drumming up all these ways to try to get rid of Castro. And one of the plans that had taken some bit of shape right as Eisenhower was leaving office was a plan to actually use Cuban exiles and Cuban refugees and train them as a guerrilla army of sorts to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro's government. So that plan started in its very basic stages in the last days of the Eisenhower administration. And then during the transition period, that's when Kennedy came into the picture, and he beefed up the plan, and that's when it went forward. And we all pretty much know how the Bay of Pigs disaster ended, where people were killed and captured. And it was an unbelievable public relations black eye for the U.S. and
big mess.
Well, it's interesting too, because I wonder, when we have these kind of conflicts and we do have leadership changes, it's don't change your horse midstream. So I wonder about that, if you have a presidential change when you've been working, and especially when it's kind of find it interesting even today, in modern history as we make it, when you have presidents that maybe, they have that time where they communicate, but if they don't get along, how much, I wonder about that even with Afghanistan, of what happened, how much intelligence really got shared, and I don't want to get political, but if the presidents aren't getting along and there's a change of leadership and we're swapping horses, that's a dangerous thing. But because we have a political system that, we must vote on this date, those kind of things kind of go out the window. So it's,
but if you're
interesting.
if you're serving in the military, and when you enter the military, you are under the auspices of, say, the Republican Party, and then 4 or 5 years later, suddenly you are still in the military, and now you're under the auspices of the Democratic Party. The shift in viewpoints is pretty huge. So how did people on the ground, how do our troops handle the shift in management that way?
Right. Well, it's not always easy to do, and a lot of times there are things from the higher echelon that are done to try to prepare the troops for the transition in leadership. And it could pretty much be in the form of a memo. It could be in the form of new command policies that are put out. But that's one thing that I personally can attest to, because I actually served under 3 different presidents. I entered the Army at the tail end of the Bush years, and then I served on active duty throughout the Obama years, and then I was a reservist throughout the Trump administration. So I can tell you that each one of those administrations had different policies that affected the military in different ways. And there was always a little bit of whipsawing that happened as one administration transitioned from the other, because you would have one administration that would say, okay, well, we're winding down these wars here and we're winding down these conflicts. And then, okay, because we're winding down these conflicts, we're going to pursue policies A, B, and C, and we're going to draw down the force. And then you have a new administration that comes in and says, well, okay, I saw what happened in the previous administration, but I think it went too far. So we're going to halt the reduction in force, and we're going to try to beef up our services again. And all of you guys who were involuntarily put out of the military before, hey, if you want to come back, we'll open up some slots for you. So that's just one example of something that I witnessed in real time. But in a lot of ways, that's really just the cost of business when you live in a democratic society and you have these elections and you have these changeovers in political leadership. There's always going to be those downstream effects. And, you have some transitioning administrations who do it well. And then you will have other administrations who, just take everything that their predecessor did and just completely throw it out the window.
That is an old business thing too. Someone comes in and takes over a company and they're like, that's it, everything is out.
Clear the table.
Just clear the table. And it's like throw the baby and the bath water out and wonder what happens.
Yeah.
It's that's hard to have.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm there. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
You went away for a little.
It's all right. Maybe I'm supposed to shut up. I think I'm going to say something I shouldn't. No, but I think those big abrupt changes are very difficult for a company, and it's very difficult for troops to have that abrupt thing. But it is, like you said, that's the way it is. But I see that kind of management style in corporations is really starting to go out the window. And especially now when people are going, I don't have to go back to work for you if you're going to treat me like that. It's kind of, it's a big, but then that creates an opportunity for someone else. So it's kind of this weird cycle and spin cycle. But going back to what Nancy, the whole thing with President's Day and presidents who served, I mean, like I was saying earlier, that she's always saying, like, we should have leadership, at least the vice president should have some kind of military training, or they should have done something in there to understand a little bit, right? Because when you think about when we go to war or the dealings with North Korea, Russia, China, there's got to be something. It's more than just having someone there for the economy, and it's more than all of that. Those international relationships, like Ike really did show about, like you were saying, diplomacy. He was 100% there with that, but at the same time understood maneuvers and understood planning and execution and warfare, tactical warfare, like how things can work. So how much do you think, like Nancy, right, with that in regards to presidents should have some kind of training? I mean, maybe just put them through boot camp if they didn't.
Well,
I
mean, think about it this way. Would you like to go under surgery with someone who's never been to medical school? I mean, I really, yeah, well, that's unfortunate, but I really do believe if you are going to run for office, that you should have served in the military, because then you have at least proven your dedication to the United States. And you understand what it is when you start talking about going to war or invading a country, or I don't see how you even make decisions based on no experience.
Especially nuclear war.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I was all about, he knew that was on the horizon, and he was already trying to make plans to defend our country against nuclear war. So, I mean, he was very visionary, I think.
He was. And I'm inclined to agree. I really think that if someone is going to run for president, then they should, at the very least, have served in the military, or
absolutely
had some kind of at the very least had some kind of public service job, in the sense in the sense where you're helping people in more than more than just an official capacity. Say if you were a first responder, probably
Mhm.
been a firefighter, paramedic. I think that only when you've had that kind of experience do you have really the best mindset to make those hard decisions and know what the second and third order effects are going to be when you send somebody into harm's way. And
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, that reminds me, the whole topic of discussion reminded me of not the movie Starship Troopers, but if you ever read the book Starship Troopers, the original book that the movie was based on, one of the central themes in that book was what separated a civilian from a citizen. And the only way that you could become a citizen and that you could get fully enfranchised rights to vote or to hold any type of political office was that you had to serve in the military. And you had to serve a certain number of years. And only through that experience of service to the nation and to the community were you deemed to be wise enough to make those political decisions, either as a voter or as a public official. So that concept has been around for a while, and it really does have a lot of merit, I think. Now,
I think so. Yeah.
I agree with
I
that.
mean, why should somebody who has no experience make the biggest decisions that affect the most amount of people? It doesn't make sense to me.
It's just when I look in just graduating high school in South Africa, I know we've touched on this, it was mandatory to go into the military for 2 years for the guys, not for the girls. Israel is different. I don't know if they're still doing that today. Israel, men and women went, and it would be different kinds of things you're doing. And I wonder about that, because it's reality. And I wonder about, like, when we talk about nuclear war, and do you just have that thought of pushing that little red button, and it's like playing a video game versus being in real combat. Those two completely, what is it like to be, on the ground and have fear, like real fear, not, and bravery, and to still go out there and have to do something and really live to a commitment. I think that's a huge thing. And I think that's something that just as civilians or citizens or people, we should also understand what weaponry can do. And it's just so easy to look at something being blown up on TV or in a video game versus what real, I
what really happens.
I tried shooting guns and that hurt, man.
Yeah.
So it's a whole thing that I think there's some training that should be there in general. But I do want to go back to Ike again too, because I was also reading that he is this big guy in warfare. Like, he's done so much. He's decorated. He's, done all these amazing things. However, wasn't he also trying to kind of cut down how much was put in funding wise into the military service? Like, what was going on with that? Was it a good thing? I mean, was it that I was like, wow, I didn't expect that.
Right. And that was actually one of the more controversial decisions that Ike had made throughout his presidency. If there was anyone who was qualified to talk about any type of military matters, it was him. But what he thought at the time, and even when he implemented these decisions, he drew a lot of fierce criticism for it. He said, I look at the changing nature of warfare, and I see the future battlefield being one of strategic nuclear retaliation. And I see that a lot of the conventional warfare assets that we've had over time are becoming more and more obsolete, and that these future wars, if and when they happen, are largely either going to be fought by proxy or they're going to be handled under the banner of nuclear power and strategic retaliation. So if that's the case, let me beef up all the nuclear capabilities that we have. Let me invest in a lot of these strategic missiles. Let me invest in tactical nukes. Let me invest in aircraft that will be able to engage other aircraft on a strategic level.
Oh, wow.
And from and from ranges that are beyond line of sight. And the downstream effect of that policy was that it eroded a lot of our conventional capabilities. And it was almost as though the prevailing wisdom at the time, not only throughout the Defense Department, but some of the concepts that Ike held dear, was that there's going to be less of an emphasis on conventional training and more of who can fire off what weapon first. And as a result, we lost a lot of the we lost a lot of the individual training that soldiers would have otherwise gotten. And we also lost a lot of the dogfighting skills that our pilots had earned and owned throughout World War II in Korea. Because if you take a look at the Army side of the house, it was okay. Well, if we're putting more emphasis on guarding these nuclear sites, there's going to be less of an emphasis on maneuver training. There's going to be less of an emphasis on keeping our tactical skills sharp. And if you look on the Air Force side of the house, it was okay. Well, if we're expected to fire off a nuclear missile, from ranges up to and including 100 miles, do we really need to be focusing on our dogfighting skills? Do we need to be focusing on how to engage in air-to-air combat if we can just rely on a missile and rely on a radar to lock on the target from X amount of miles away? And it was that policy, and it was that mindset that led to a lot of the readiness issues that we had in the late 1950s and in the early 60s, and how we had to jump through our skin to rebuild a lot of the tactical edges that we had lost.
Oh, wow. So he was a kind of ahead of his time and kind of pulled the trigger on that too soon. Yet now what he's talking about is now, right? He was kind of a future thinker, but doing it. It's like, I remember
maybe he just put all his eggs in one basket, kind of. And let's neglect this and put everything over here instead of maybe strengthen over here, but don't forget other things can happen in between.
It's the baby in the bathwater again.
Right.
It's the same of the day. Well, I think about that, like, just even remember Nancy with the magazine in South Africa. Nancy got the big supercomputer. We were able to print out our own film for the magazine. Cool. We had things on disc. We took it to the printers each time, and we were ahead of and they looked at her and they're like, we can't do this. We're not ready for that. So we had to start the magazine all over again. So, it's those kind of little things. You're in the future, but it's not where the world is working at that point. Yeah. But now we are, and I look at some of the things he did do. Didn't he start NASA? I mean, he signed the Civil Rights Act, but then he also saw what Russia was doing and went, "That's it. We're going to start NASA, too." Yeah. So he was futuristic, and not wow.
Yeah, I grew up with people saying that the Russians would get into space first, and they would go up on the moon and put a giant mirror up on the moon, and it would reflect the sunlight and burn the United States up.
Are those the people that are part of the Flat Earth Society?
I don't know, but that's as a kid, that's what I used to hear. And so you got this fear of the Russians, number one. And like every time somebody's like, oh, they're launching a missile or we're going to put a rocket space, I'm like, yeah, what are you really doing with the rocket ship? Are you putting a big mirror on the moon? What are you really doing? Because there's all these rumors that just all through high school, there were all these rumors about people going to the moon, or, nations going to the moon. Everybody's a space race to get to the moon to put up a giant mirror. It's so stupid.
Well,
maybe it's a possibility. I don't know, and I don't know who started those rumors.
Have you heard about that stuff?
It's weird.
Are they the flat earthers?
I don't know where that came from.
They were, or at least of the same ilk.
Yeah, right. So looking at Ike and then looking at Combat Diaries, when you're going, because these are true stories, right? And you think about World War II, and we just lost, the Tuskegee Airmen just a few days ago. One of the soldiers. Right. I mean, you just look at that
But he was
history is,
102. So,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
he lived a good life.
But we are losing, our veterans of World War II. We're down to very few. But Combat Diaries, tell us a little bit about that, because it's got to touch into Eisenhower somewhere, right? When you were writing it.
Right. Okay, so the Combat Diaries is a collection of about 24 veterans, all of whom have provided their stories for this book, and it tells their true stories of how they went from being just regular, everyday, average Americans like you and me, and how they answered the call of duty, and what each of their individual journeys were throughout the Great Crusade that we call World War II. And what I really tried to accomplish with the Combat Diaries is just telling a true no holds barred story of war from the perspective of the men who lived it, and what their thoughts were, and what their feelings were, and what they brought to the table, and a lot of the images that they wrestled with, not only while they were going through that conflict, but also how they dealt with it in the years afterwards. And it runs the entire gamut of World War II. I have quite a collection of stories, and the broader theme that I think ties a lot of these stories together is just what the spirit of man can accomplish when you're put in a situation like that. For instance, I have a story of a young Navy pilot who had his first taste of combat at the Battle of Midway, and he was flying these Dauntless dive bombers against these Japanese carriers. And and to put yourself in his mindset at the time, he was telling himself, okay, well, so far the Japanese had dictated the tempo up to this point in the war. We still haven't fully recovered from Pearl Harbor. By God, we need a decisive victory, and we really need it quick. So how is this going to play out? Because if we lose at Midway, chances are we're not going to have the staying power that we need in order to win the Pacific War. At least that's what he was telling himself. And then you also have the story of an American pilot who was fighting in the Burma theater at a time, and when he was stationed in Burma, he had the happy misfortune of being able to capture a fully intact Japanese Zero. And the story gets a little more interesting at that point, because it was pretty early in the war. This was 1942. And at this point, the Americans were still flying the P-40, which, as many aviation experts can tell you, was an inferior plane to the Zero. So now the American forces had their hands on a fully intact Zero. They wanted to keep it, they wanted to preserve it, and they wanted to send it back to the US for testing. So you have this one particular pilot who was selected to fly this captured Zero from one American airfield to another. He was flying it from Burma over into India. Well, the airfield he was flying it to, at the other end of India, for some reason, they didn't get the memo that a captured Japanese Zero was on its way to their airfield. So when their spotters see a Zero coming in, they think it's an enemy plane. They think it's piloted by an enemy pilot, and they scramble a nearby group of P-40s to intercept it. Well, here is where the fickle hand of fate comes in, because as luck would have it, the Zero actually ran out of gas, and he ended up belly in the jungle just moments before the P-40s could pull the trigger on him.
Wow, that's like divine intervention.
That's crazy.
Like, that's some crazy.
That's crazy.
He lands in the jungle, he gets out of the plane and he's like, oh my God, I can't believe this plane ran out of gas. But then when the local air crews come by to pick him up, they say, Philip, you are the luckiest SOB alive, because this pulling the trigger on you. He's just like, oh, wow. I guess it was a good thing. Yes.
So this is crazy. So he has a dude captured on board, right? So I want to do a whole new segment on that, because prisoners of war, like we've never talked about them. There's so many prison of war camps, like across this, country too. Right. I mean, we had Italians and Germans, and I've heard about them taking up painting and making wine and whatever, all kinds of crazy stories. But when you capture someone, how is he making sure that that guy's really not going to turn around and try and slit his throat while he's flying? You know what I mean? That's
Right.
He's got to kind of have that. And I was, just making sure he can get there with that person on board, and
Right.
then they don't want to kill him necessarily, right? They want to use it for information at that point.
Right. Yeah. Well, as far as the story is concerned, they were able to capture that Japanese Zero in the sense that it accidentally landed at an Allied airfield.
Okay.
And yeah, and by the time the pilot had recognized the arrow, his plane was completely surrounded, and that was how they captured that pilot. And yeah, so it was after they captured the pilot, got him away from his plane, that's when they said, okay, well, we're going to take this Zero. Yeah, that's why. And so we're going to take this captured Zero, and we're going to take it to another Allied airfield that's closer to a port where we can put it on a ship and have it sent back to the U.S.
Paint it or something, But what about people? If you capture someone, like, that's it. We should just do a show on that, because I was even thinking, you're talking about you went through 3 administrations. Think about it, Guantanamo Bay. Like now they're starting to look at doing something about it. I mean, everybody thought Barack Obama was going to close that down. We actually had.
I believe he tried, but something.
It's bizarre. There, we had the 2 attorneys on our show that wrote a book about it way back when. I think it was one of our first year of doing radio that was they were on, and it's interesting what's happening now. It's just crazy. That whole. It's still there. It's. Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens, but let's do a show on prisoners of war and what happens, because when do you capture someone and what do you do with them? Do you kill them or not? We know what I mean? Well, that happens, but a lot of times don't you want their information?
Well, I think that you don't kill them unless you have to, from the United States point of view. That's how I was brought up. I was always told that
unless you're Osama bin Laden.
Capture, well, he needed to be assassinated. That's what happened to him because what he did. So that's different. But when you go into war, if you have people that you both sides have stopped shooting and there's prisoners on both sides, historically the United States always gave the impression that those would now become prisoners and that they would not be mistreated and not killed. True? Whereas other sides in warfare, that like if the Germans captured somebody, they were in real big trouble.
We did it where, like in Vietnam, was it the Japanese that did?
The Japanese did terrible
under
things
nails, people's nails and stuff.
Yeah.
So is America good, like Nancy is saying, or?
Well, that's what I was brought up to believe. No idea.
Well, there is a very strict code of conduct with how we handle our enemy prisoners of war.
Right.
And it's pretty well regulated by the Geneva Convention. Right. Now, of course, the wild card in this deck is that you're counting on whoever you're going to war against to also follow the Geneva Convention. Which, of course, there's no guarantee that they will, whether or not they were a signator to the convention or not. But as far as we Americans go, it's always understood that if an enemy surrenders to you, then you accept that surrender, and you are to treat them as an enemy prisoner of war according to a standardized list that says, okay, when you first encounter an enemy EPW, what you have to do is this: you have to make sure that one, that they are fully neutralized. You have to make sure that they are disarmed. You have to search them for any pertinent information. You have to separate them from any of their comrades. You have to make sure that they are silenced. You have to make sure that they are safeguarded, and then you have to speed them to the rear, where they're going to be properly processed and interrogated either by the nearest military police unit or perhaps a CIA detachment or even a counterintelligence detachment, somebody who is a trained professional to get them to share the information that they need while still preserving their dignity as a human being. So
Yeah.
that is the that is the overall picture that was drilled into us, you know,
Mhm.
when
Yeah.
we were in the military, and it was expected that we were to follow that particular protocol.
Mhm.
But yeah, you know, it's it is a night and day difference with how a lot of other countries handle their prisoners of war. Assuming
Absolutely.
they kill you on the spot, you know, you can expect to be subjected to some pretty horrific treatment. And
Mhm.
you know, there are dozens upon dozens of POW stories who can validate that.
Mhm.
And you think about McCain, John McCain, what he went through as a
Mhm.
prisoner of war, you know, and I always thought he had some balance in regards to military, from what I could tell. I'm, you know, like, I'm not military, but it seemed like he would have been good at that, you know, if he was president. I think he would have understood some things a little bit more than, you know, I didn't, you know, I'm not going to talk about who, what, where fighting, but I thought, you know, he had been there, you know, so you understand. And I think if you have been in a prisoner of war, you really have an understanding. That's a whole other level,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
that's scary, you know, and I think he was a prisoner of war for a while, quite a while. Yeah.
Mhm.
He was spent 7 years at the Hanoi Hilton, and
Mhm.
yeah, that was you know, it's actually funny that you mentioned that, because it was his experience as a POW. I think in an indirect fashion helped him secure the election for the Senate seat that he held in Arizona,
Mm.
because he was from a military family. His father was a Navy admiral, and you know, as expected for any number of military kids, you spend a lot of time moving around. You're never really in one place for too long, and
Mm.
it's really hard for you to declare any one place as your hometown. Well, when he was running for that Senate seat in Arizona, one of the issues that came up was that, well, you know, hey, this guy McCain, he's not from here. He's not a native Arizonan. He
Mhm.
doesn't know people of Arizona in the same way that his opponent does. And his opponent really tried to drive that home.
Mm.
But the way he shut down that argument was brilliant. He said, look, I was in a military family, okay? I moved around from place to place. I didn't have the luxury of calling a great state like Arizona my home. In fact, now that I think about it, the longest time I ever spent in one place was the 7 years I spent as a POW at the Hanoi Hilton.
Wow. See,
Mm.
that was smart.
Wow. That's a
Yeah,
good one. Yeah.
Wow.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think we've ever
yeah.
stayed anywhere for 7 years either. I'm just thinking about that. I don't think Nancy and I have ever stayed in one place for 7 years.
Oh, 7
That's
years. I'll have to think
that's
about
a hell
that.
of a long time. I
I
wouldn't know what to
know.
do. Yeah, that would no.
Hmm.
That's I think, you know,
Mm-mm.
military brats, that's a hard life, but I think
You learn so much
you
more.
learn so much, you know,
Mhm.
and you know, the spouses go through a lot, you know, people travel a lot just even for a business, you know, and I think
Mhm.
Nancy and I are apparently addicted to it. But as a kid, I mean, I think I went to, we were saying 15 or 16 schools. And
Mhm.
it is difficult. You're the new kid on the block for one day, everyone's interested, and then it's like, oh, you're not from here, then you suck. You know what I mean? And so it's a different thing. And I didn't have that military village necessarily,
Mm-mm.
you know what I mean? But
Nope.
Right.
there's that community for kids that I think that they learned, and it does make you strong as an individual,
Mhm.
being a
Mhm.
military
Yeah.
brat traveling. Did you do that with your family, or because you've
Yeah,
traveled a
for a while.
lot? Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, my dad got out of the military when I was still very young, so
Mm.
I
Mm.
was at least fortunate enough to call Houston my hometown, and I
Yeah,
had enough youth there that, yeah, I still consider it my hometown.
yeah. We're going to be going through there again soon. That's cool. It's huge now, and maybe next
Mhm.
time we go through it won't rain on us. But you know,
It's rained every time we go
it's
through
Stevie
this
Ray
state.
Vaughan's fault. That's it. It's a
Maybe.
Texas flood, you know. Well,
Mm.
good stuff. Mike, thanks again. Always a
Mm.
pleasure having you on the show. What is the date that Combat Diaries comes out in March?
Okay, so we're looking at a release date of March 15th.
Perfect.
Cool.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Awesome. Awesome. And everyone can pre-order it on Amazon, right?
Yeah, sure can.
Awesome. Awesome,
Cool.
everyone. So MikeGuardia.com is the website, and we'll be back on the very first Monday of March. We'll be back on with you, and who
Cool.
knows what we'll talk about next. All right.
Sounds good.
Prisoners of war. Why not? All right. Take care, Mike.
All righty. Thanks, ladies. Always a pleasure.
Okay.